So to tonight's event, I'm really pleased to welcome back David Verghese, who is a really accomplished naval historian. And some of you may have been here earlier in the year, or was it last year, David? I can't remember, for the talk about HMS Exeter, the ship that was the pride of the West Country and participated in the Battle of the River Plate. David is a naval researcher and biographer for the period 1900 to 1970. He's very busy. He's written 30 biographies to date of sailors who've served in this time period. He developed an interest in the somewhat mysterious role and nature of the Bath Admiralty while living in the area several years ago. And he now lives on an ex-Admiralty site at Gosport. Can't stay away from the Admiralty. This evening provides an opportunity for him to share the fruits of his research with you. Please welcome David Verghese.
Thank you, Joe, for that very kind introduction. And thank you especially for all those who've attended on this very wet and miserable evening tonight. And of course, those people who are sensibly watching the talk, listening to the talk online. Okay, as you know, many of you might know, the Admiralty came here in 1939. And as my title says, they stayed longer than originally expected. The plan of my talk, we're going to look at what happened in late 38 and 39, the decision to bring the apparently the online people didn't hear that, but all I did was to go through the plan of what I'm going to be talking about. So the online audience haven't missed, thankfully, anything already. One or two bits of the talk will be interactive, so please keep on your toes and don't go to sleep. Okay. Mid-1930s, it became pretty obvious to the politicians of this country and the military men that we would eventually go to war with Germany. As you know, as you will recall, Germany was expanding territorially, looking east, but also looking west. And in late 38, the government began to think very seriously about what to do about the government departments in London. Not just the Admiralty, but many of the departments. We'll see in a moment. The big danger was the potential of bombing by the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe at this point had about 1,000 bombers in total, far more than the Royal Air Force at this time. The city of Bath was chosen by what was called the Anderson Committee to be the place to move parts of the Admiralty to. And of course, it had plenty of hotels to be taken over. It had good rail links, both with London, via God's wonderful railway, and of course, it linked directly with the important naval bases of Devonport and Portsmouth. Joe, you've done something. It's not working.
The clicker.
Yeah.
Straight. Oh, gremlins tonight. Let me just go and find Paul.
Okay. Paul is the techno expert here. I first spoke here in 2013, and there were gremlins then. This guy appeared through that door, came down, did this, didn't say a word, walked away, and it was fine. So hopefully he'll do the same. I'll try and talk through some of this at the moment. The departments that moved to Bath were what I call the supply side of the Admiralty. The Admiralty was absolutely huge. Oh, well done. I promise you, that was no slower and no faster than in 2013. Yes, the supply of ships, guns, weapons, shells, torpedoes, spares victualling food. I live on an ex-Admiralty victualling yard in Gosport at the moment. So that's the type of department that came here. And Bath was designated by the code AA. You do some research, you might see it. And the X on the screen was where they put a number in for the 30 main directorates. So, as you know, war in Europe was declared by Mr. Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, on the 3rd of September. And just within 3 days later, the Anderson Committee met to decide who should immediately be evacuated to Bath. And the Admiralty representative for the Royal Navy was a chap called George Cotton, the Under Secretary to the Admiralty. He reported to Sir Alan Carter, the Secretary of the Navy, and he in turn reported to the First Lord of the Admiralty. You ought to know that the Air Ministry also moved some departments to Harrogate, and the War Office stayed exactly where it was on the other side of Whitehall. And that was going to cause a lot of friction throughout the war, and even later on, that the army stayed there right under, the effects of the bombing and the various London blitzes. Now, the detail doesn't matter too much, but this is from a secret file at the National Archives, the Anderson Committee, and there is George Cotton representing the Navy, Air Ministry, and most of the ministries are represented here. So their job was to decide which ministries and sub-departments of which ministries would move to places throughout the UK. George Cotton, that is the only picture I could find of him. It took many months to find him. He's the rather somber-looking gentleman on the left, George Cotton. Chap on the right, I'll come to later. And for the youngsters in the audience, the lady in the middle is named Queen Mary. She was the wife of King George V, and she lived well into the 1950s. I love this picture because look at these girls here, these ladies here, probably from the typing pool, getting in on the act. People still do it now, they're called selfies. So, the committee met on the 6th, and by the 30th of September, almost 4,000 people had moved to Bath. And the most senior person I could find was an assistant controller by the name of Rear Admiral Dorling. But in the meantime, billeting officers had been sent down here to find lodgings, and they were working under the Emergencies Power Act, which meant that they could press scan places, houses, rooms in houses at their own whim. The owners, it was decided that the owners of these places would just be paid £1 guinea, 21 shillings a week for 7 nights, bed, breakfast and dinner. That was fairly unpopular at first. But they did that, and you'd have a knock on the door and the billeting officer had tremendous power. Most residents accepted it, but you'll hear a bit later, not all did. And they gave the nickname guinea pigs to some of these people from London who they thought were sort of middle-class, well-to-do people imposing themselves on Bath. Bit of profiteering. Also remember that many children were moved from London, from the big cities, to Bath as evacuees, and that helped to swell the population. They had to be found accommodation as well. This first picture shows a group of the engineers in Chief Department on the 6th of September moving down here to Bath. They all look pretty happy, well dressed, and there they are at Paddington Station. The next two pictures are well known here in Bath. That's of people arriving at what was the Empire Hotel, but it's now apartments in Bath, and you can see that they're carrying, oops, it easy. They're carrying just, I don't know why it's not working, small cases, etc. They came down with a minimum of their sort of private clothes and paperwork just like that. By December, there were 10,000 people from the Admiralty here, mainly civil servants, but also a fair sprinkling of naval officers. There was some stress, of course, because these people had been pulled away from London at short notice. They had left their families behind. And of course, the big worry was that London would be bombed, much of Greater London. So they themselves were under some stress. And the little comment at the bottom there, HH. In early December, William Joyce, known as Lord Haw-Haw for German propaganda, welcomed on, do you remember those? Well, perhaps you won't remember. Hello, this is Germany calling. And he welcomed people from the Admiralty in London to Bath. So word had got out. And of course, all over the UK, there would have been fifth columnists. Chris, 2 weeks ago, or was it last week? 2 weeks ago, talked about the informants in Bath, informing the Germans of, the nature of the geography of Bath. And such people were dotted around the country with radio sets. So it was only most of the Admiralty, especially the operational, the naval part of the Admiralty, stayed in London. And they were, it was headed by the First Lord of the Admiralty. And on the 3rd of September, 1939, a new First Lord of the Admiralty was took. Can anybody recall who it was? There's the man there. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. Now he's looking very, very pensive. For years he'd been a backbench MP in the Houses of Parliament. And I listened to one of his speeches in preparation of this, and it was only a couple of sentences I listened to, and he said very loud from the backbenches, Germany is arming. She is rapidly arming, and no one will stop her. But over those years of, through the governments of Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and latterly Neville Chamberlain, he was seen as an alarmist. And so no one took much notice. The general mood was one of appeasement. But Churchill, and thank God that he rose to the occasion, there he is. This picture was taken in probably October 1939. Now, the Admiralty itself, we won't go into too much detail. I took a slide out with some detail on, it's in the discussion if we need it. But basically, there was the 5 Sea Lords, all admirals from full admiral of the fleet down to rear admirals. But when I did the research, I looked at many of the Navy lists at the time, and I found huge numbers of titles: vice chief, deputy chief, assistants, and all these people. It was ever so hard to unravel. It would have even taxed, I think, Sir Humphrey Appleby to try to explain to anybody. One interesting department I found was naval intelligence. And perhaps some of you know that the author, Ian Fleming, Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, worked in that department. And there's the Admiralty now. That's a recent picture. It's available on the internet. It's all been cleaned up and modernized. You see it every year at Trooping the Colour, and of course the November the 11th ceremony. And that's where all the Sea Lords and the Navy was based. I don't know how many of you know London well, but just around the corner from there, there's this great big brown ugly building. And that was the Admiralty Citadel that was built in 1940. It's actually very, very bomb-proof. It survived the war, and many departments moved into there. It was full of teleprinters and all sorts of communications equipment, underground passages, etc. And it's still there. Most people walk by it without realizing what it is. So the Admiralty came to Bath. Now, what I've done here on the left-hand side of the slide, these are the main, what I call directorates. Some of them are large departments. I put on the right side where they moved to in Bath. You'll know many of these places. And then the sites in yellow are the 3 major Hutment sites that they moved to in from late 41 to late 42 as the buildings were completed. Just give you a moment to look at that. Those are the main departments. Okay, some of those early locations in Bath, you'll recognize that. The Empire Hotel, it's now apartments, but that became the headquarters of the Admiralty in Bath, and some of the senior people moved there. And when I say they occupied the hotels, they came in, they threw the residents out because people lived there permanently at very short notice, probably with very, very little compensation. This was the Emergency Powers Act. That's the Grand Pump Room Hotel. It was infested with cockroaches. It was very old, falling apart, and the Admiralty ripped out many of the bathrooms and put offices all over it. It got knocked down, I think, in 1959. There's a picture of the back of it. It was in Stall Street, and not far from here. That's on the lower left there, that's the Pulteney Hotel. This is a fairly old picture in that canopied entrance disappeared, I think, in about the 1920s, but the whole of that building was occupied by the Admiralty. It's strange to see Pulteney Street like that without any traffic, but I guess there weren't too many cars around in those days. This, as some of you might know, is Kingswood School, that played an important role in the Admiralty function, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So what about some of the other Admiralty locations? There's hotels they took over, I mentioned. There is listed some of the schools and colleges they took over, and some of the other properties lower down. And altogether, at the National Archives, I found references to about 40 different sites. Some large I've covered, and some were quite small. But there's one significant small site I haven't mentioned on my slide yet. It's very pertinent to tonight. Might anyone suggest what it is? Well, actually, yes, someone just said it, and someone in the audience on the front row pointed at it. Could you mention the back here? It's this place, and this is the comment on the website. So it was occupied, I guess, from 1939 to 1959. It's on the Bureau website. In the Admiralty records at the National Archives and at the other place I went to, the Imperial War Museum, it's called Queen Square. So if you do your own private research, when you see Queen Square, it was this building. And one of the references I got, Mike Macklin, a local author, he informed me that it was the modeling department that was held here. Okay, let's look at one or two of the important departments in some detail. The hydrographic department, that was housed in Lagan House, which was one of the, I think, boarding houses of the Royal School for Daughters of Military Officers. The building is still there, and that housed the Hydrographic and Tides Department. Their job was to produce the thousands of charts that went onto ships of all sizes, from huge battleships down to the landing craft at D-Day. They all carried charts, and they were designed, researched, and produced here at Lagan House in Bath in the 1940s. I put a figure here. Almost 31 million charts were printed for the Royal Navy during that wartime period, covering about 5,000 vessels. And by chance, very timely chance, a book has just been published in June of last month by a local historian, Dr. Adrian Webb, who's a well-known Somerset historian. For those of you who might be interested, that's the title of the book, Churchill's Secret Chart Makers. I haven't seen the book yet, but I would like to take a look at it sometime. One department I want to focus on is a directorate that did an absolute brilliant job, given that they had moved away from London and we're talking about wartime Britain. And that's the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors, RCNC, founded in the early 19th century They were responsible for both the design and the construction of warships. That word construction is important because I'll cover on later slides where some of them went to. And in 1939, the whole department of 141 transferred from London down to Bath. Now, to be a naval constructor, you had to go to Greenwich Royal Naval College for 3 years and then spend a year at sea. 1939, by December, of that 141, approximately 1/3 were located in Bath, 1/3 were at the dockyards and the shipping companies. Important because when ships are constructed, before they're handed over to the Navy, the constructing shipyard has to take it out for a trial. It's handed over to the Royal Navy. It's not yet commissioned. The Royal Navy put it through its paces, the naval trials to prove it. So 1/3 were at the dockyards and 1/3 of them were at sea, testing these ships out. Typically, the young lieutenants were then aged about 22, and as they progressed, they became civilians. 1942, the RCNC moved to Fox Hill, but the director moved back to Whitehall, Sir Stanley Goodall. He wanted to be in the center of things, and he didn't want the Sea Lords to be making decisions about the building of ships that he had no control while he was 100 miles away. So he moved back. In 1945, the end of the war, we've still got this ratio of a third at the Admiralty in Bath, happened to be in Fox Hill then, 1/3 in the shipyards, and about 1/3 at sea. And got a couple of pictures here. The first picture is fairly well known. You might recognize it. Those are constructor lieutenants working on the, on the left, top left, it says what they're working on. Now, this picture in several sites is labeled Fox Hill. I really do not think it's Fox Hill for a couple of or 3 reasons. Firstly, the windows aren't the windows of the Hutments. Secondly, and significantly, I think that structure at the window is probably one of those big iron bridges that appear across Bath. And and of course, the windows are much bigger than the Hutment sites. The lower picture shows engineers working on drawings there. And for the younger people in the audience, they're using something called slide rules and log tables. Now, Lottie, Josie, Billy, that's how we did maths in the old days. We didn't know what a calculator was, and we certainly didn't know what a computer was. But I'm not sure what happened to my slide rule. Okay, so yeah. Now, in coming up to Bath, it was important that there had to be some local defense. And when I say defense, I mean security defense, because there were a lot of what was termed, and this is not my term, it's the term of the time, undesirables in Bath. And so a chap called Lieutenant Frank Twiss was scheduled down at Devonport. He was out of a job to come to find some local people. He didn't want Bath people to bring them up here to secure the civilian sites. He brought his bosun up, 4 gunnery petty officers, and I can't read the number, 120, thank you, local guys. They occupied an infant school, I don't know which one, and the main task was security. Bath was not defended militarily. There were no barrage balloons over the Hutment sites, over the centre. There were no anti-aircraft batteries situated around. Even on, say, the Limpley Stoke Valley, on Avon, where it would have been perfect for AA guns. And the idea was not to draw attention to the departments and the directorates at Bath. And that was probably the right decision. Some Home Guard units came up, 5 companies, A to E, of the Home Guard, and they did a good job. Do not mix up the Home Guard with those characters you see on Dad's Army, a program I love watching, and soon I watch it all the time. 1941, one of the files at the National Archives is focused on the damage that was done. Oh, sorry, I've got to go back one. Yeah. Sorry for jumping ahead of myself there. Army resistance. There's a letter in the files at the National Archives within that huge box of files there from a commander here in Bath, a naval commander, to his equivalent, that's a lieutenant colonel at the regional headquarters of the army. And he was asking for some professional soldiers to come here and defend Bath in case it was ever attacked. It was expected in 1941. This is before the German front, Barbarossa, opened against the Soviet Union. It was expected that this country would be invaded. And I saw the letter and I saw the response from this lieutenant colonel who said, "Why on earth do you want army people in Bath? It's a civilian city. The nearest port is 23 miles away, being Bristol, and there's nobody available." That went down in Bath like a cup of cold sick, I assure you. I almost wrote, now it shows one thing, it shows the lack of appreciation between different branches of the military. There was no love lost between the army and the navy. It wasn't until Admiral Sir Bertrand Ramsay, the hero of Dunkirk, did an awful lot of work in 43 and 44 to get the three main military arms together. And here's where George Cotton comes in again. If an attack on Bath was expected, he drew up plans for the Admiralty departments here to be moved to these towns that I mentioned here. And in the files on this, every department, including this place, had to put in a return of how many tons of paperwork they had. And some of them were tons. And it was ever so boring to read, but slightly interesting in that I went through all 40 departments, and the department with the least amount of paper was Queen Square, this building. And of course, if you're making models, you probably don't have any paper. And each department, Directorate, also had to put in the number of ovens and stoves they had to burn this stuff quickly in case the Germans landed by parachute on Charmy Down and came down into the town. And all the Queen Square put in was, we have only got 2.1 pounds of paper. Not very much, but yeah. So if Bath was attacked, and as you know from the talk a couple of weeks ago that Chris Kilminster gave, there was this Baedeker raid on Bath. For those of you not familiar, the Royal Air Force had just bombed the Baltic ports of Lubeck and Rostock. They were historic Hanseatic towns. There were also important naval bases on the Baltic, but much of the old town, the cultural centers of each, were pretty well destroyed. The Air Force tended to bomb from very high levels. It was called saturation bombing. It wasn't very accurate. And the German High Command took offense at this. And so 5 cities in the UK, in England, were targeted: Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York, and Canterbury. And Bath was the second of these. And just very quickly, Chris spoke a couple of weeks ago, 3 raids over 2.5 days and nights, over 4,000 bombs dropped, a mixture of high explosive and incendiaries. They're the numbers of lives that were sadly lost and people injured. But I want to focus in this talk, it's about the Admiralty, on the damage to the Admiralty. Fox Hill, it could be seen by the bombers, by the German Luftwaffe, but they didn't really know the purpose of the 3 Hutment sites. They knew they were there from photo reconnaissance, but they were such low-level buildings. it just didn't, the message didn't get through that they were important naval sites. So Fox Hill was damaged by about a couple of bombs, and I would suggest that that was a bomber returning from to their bases in Normandy and Brittany. Just saw it as a target of opportunity. The big Empire Hotel, most of the windows were knocked out, but that was pure blast damage. The Domestic Science College, that was hit pretty hard, including being machine gunned by repeated runs. And then I go through some of the damage. Prior Park College, St. James Street, a lot of vehicles went up because they were full of petrol or diesel. Ensley, very little damage, easily dealt with. And this building was hit. And this building wasn't hit directly. There was a bomb that fell onto the Francis Hotel, and the shrapnel from it, or the explosive effect of it, came and hit a lot of the windows here. It's recorded in those archives that the 6th Somerset Home Guard did a gallant job rescuing people and clearing, the safety of much of the mess there. As soon as the raid finished, the army did put in the standard heavy artillery gun, the 3.7 gun, at several sites around Bath, but it was probably a little too little, a little too late. And it's ironic that Bath was never, ever attacked again in World War II. Look at this. I mentioned Kingswood School. They had a role in the delivery, not the design, of the Mulberry Harbors. Here's a picture. These are from their records at Kingswood School. There's some of the Admiralty civilian staff working in there. School was taken over. All the schools that were taken over, the pupils were moved to other places. I think Kingswood might have gone to Rutlandshire in the East Midlands. There's another picture there of people working away at Kingswood School. I mentioned the Mulberry Harbors. Let me just spend one slide on them. I'd love to give an hour-long lecture on the Mulberry Harbors, but we haven't got much time. It was a massive, complex feat of civil engineering that spanned across the whole 4 nations and many, many companies. When you go through the correspondence, especially the records, say at the D-Day Museum and at the Imperial War Museum, there's over 900 companies mentioned there. The biggest ones were Waits and McAlpines, but there were many. These are the 2 names that cropped up most of the time in the design. Sir John Gibson and Major General Werner, an senior army engineer, and they designed and built these harbours. There were 2 of them, one at Gold Beach at Arromanch and one at Oberha. They built these to facilitate the landing of men, material, guns, tanks, and everything you need in a war. And they were designed such that they would be a safe haven for ships, while all this was happening. If you read any article on it, there are some good books on it. It's got its own vocabulary, its own lexicon of words like gooseberry, corncobs, spuds, whales. And part of this, of course, was a security such that the Germans couldn't understand. There's a picture of the Mulberry Harbour at Arromanch, known as Mulberry Harbour B. June the 19th, just 13 days after D-Day, they saw the worst storm in the Channel for 40 years, force 8 to 9 gale, and it more or less wrecked Mulberry Harbour at Omaha. They managed to do a little bit with it for a few days and finally gave up, and much of the American stores and material were landed on the original beaches. But the British one on Gold stood up well to the storm, and there's some numbers there of the landings of troops and vehicles towards the end of the year of the war. But by early March 45, the main port of Antwerp that had been liberated by the Navy and the Canadians at Operation Valkyrie in November, Antwerp became very important for stuff landing there to be taken over the Rhine. Just to show you an effect of that, there's a nice big picture. Now, this isn't during the storm. This is probably a month afterwards, but you can see within the harbour, the waters are very still, and there's the choppy waters outside. So it was designed to do a job, and it was designed and operated very well. Okay, let's take a look at the Hutment sites. Those of you who live in Bath, you all know them: Fox Hill, Ensley, Warminster Road. I suspect there's quite a number in the audience, both here and online, who worked at some of these places. They were very much utilitarian buildings of 1 to 2 stories, designed by a chap called Sir James West, and they were built to the same design: a central corridor. I'll put a diagram up a bit later, and these 12 wings in pairs. In 1940, the end of the war, it was decided that the Admiralty would stay here, and the Hutment sites, which had been built to last about 20 years, would continue to function and be used. And if you think it, and that tells me that the move to Bath was considered by the Navy, by the Admiralty, by the government, to be a great success. Much would stay, and many families joined their husbands, it was mainly men working down here, in the sort of 45 to 47 period. Bath was a lovely place to live. Why go back to London? Much of it had been bombed all around, and the cost of living was so high there. Bath was a nice place to move to. It had a very good rugby club as well. I was born in Coventry after the war, and it was for years, it was always a big thing: Coventry versus Bath, something I've never forgotten. Anyway, I'm not going to mention the football, by the way. Fox Hill, there's a picture dated 1960, and you can imagine the German bombers flying over here on the way to the centre of Bath. Remember, the object of the Baedeker raid was to terrify and kill civilians. They went for civilian streets, civilian buildings, and of course buildings of architectural value, including just about every church in the middle of Bath. But flying over that, you can see the very low-lying buildings, and it was kept pretty well a secret in this country as to the function, the nature of them. I'm going to look at 3 of the directorates of Bath. Keep an eye on the time. I could have chosen any year, but I'm going to go for the Engineering and Chiefs Department. I've chosen 1951. That could have been 53, 55. I want to focus on the 50s now. Naval Ordnance the same year. And I'll talk about the Ship Department in 1958, because 1958 was a very significant year for this very, very large department. Just very briefly.
David, you just go a bit closer to the microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, very briefly, in this particular directorate, there were 2 admirals in charge and 4 or 5 engineering captains. A captain normally commanded a battleship, an aircraft carrier, a large cruiser, but engineering captains could not command a ship, never have done, but they could get a good job for 3 years at the Admiralty in Bath, and many came down to Bath. So the rear admirals were here for usually 2 to 2.5 years, captains for 3 years. This department in 1951 had over 300 people in it, mainly civilians, but 60 naval officers. And there throughout the slide are the typical of the specialists, the professions, the different types of engineers that worked here. I could have put in, for instance, electrical engineers, but they had their own department, the electrical engineers. I'm going to show you a series of charts now. Now, forgive the detail, but I made the slides as big as possible. I want the audience online and here to focus on the left-hand side of the slide, because that will show you the depth and breadth and scope of the specialities here down at Bath. It may well be that some of you are related to the chaps on the right-hand side, because I know there are people here who've told me that their fathers, their grandfathers worked here, but focus on the left. So engineering in chief, admin department. Go through the next one. I've got the senior assistant engineer in chief, the technical side. Now, those commanders on the right, they were merely the heads of the sub-departments. They were often called inspectors, but below them, they had a whole squad of lieutenant commanders and lieutenants. All engineers are working there. One chap keeps on cropping up, a civilian, very senior civil servant by the name of Mr. Bean, believe it or not. You'll see him several times. What's that? Research and development. And we've got Mr. Bean down here. He's the only inspector amongst all these naval commanders. And you can see on the left, the sort of R&D that they were doing in the 50s. Remember, many ships had been lost in World War II. New ships were being designed by the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors at a very rapid rate. The Cold War was beginning to get into progress and NATO had formed. We had to have new and powerful ships of many types. Again, Mr. Bean was in this department, another research and development, a directorate. Again, lots of commanders. New construction, and again, Mr. Bean has this role down here. But just look on the left at some of the things that were happening there. You're beginning to see what I call atomic stuff there, all sorts of machinery, all sorts of new ships. Engineering chief for maintenance of ships. Again, all sorts of commander engineers on the right-hand side and all sorts of different roles on the left. And some of these departments were quite large. So the Admiralty, besides being a place of employment for many, many civilians, was also a good opportunity for naval engineers to practice their skills and knowledge. I now move to the ordnance section. And when he became an admiral, I did Sir John Coote's naval biography. But there's Bath highlighted there. Again, the detail doesn't matter. This is naval ordnance, and you've got some of the weapons there, some of the rockets coming in, all sorts of long-range stuff, all sorts of equipment, optics, trials, much more advanced than that of World War II. I'll go to this slide. I just want to dwell on this slide for a moment. Do you remember I told you that Ian Fleming worked in the Admiralty? He was in London, Lieutenant Commander. Go down there, look at Q section, etc. I dug down into etc. at the National Archives. A lot of it's classified still, but it was to do with special equipment and special weapons. Q, I'll leave the rest to your imagination. It might be a red herring, but I'm convinced this is where Ian Fleming got the idea from. You youngsters, you need to watch a few James Bond films, then you know what I'm talking about. So, moving away from that, let's look at the impact upon the citizens of Bath of the Admiralty coming here. Now, I've done a lot of searching around Bath, and I was disappointed to find that I could find very little, both online and physical, at some of these places here. I did find a couple of useful articles. One by a Mr. Pat Driscoll and one by Eric Lee, who both wrote of their experiences here. Eric Lee worked at the Admiralty, London and Bath, for 49 years. Once you got into the Admiralty, often you stayed in it. Interesting work and a damn good pension afterwards. What was interesting was the bulletin correspondence. that's kept in the Bath Records Office at Guildhall. You have to make an appointment to get to it. A lot of it was routine. They called on 57B of this street, 46A of that street. But there was a proposal after the Baedeker raid, when a lot of billetees places were lost, to sleep 2 men in the bed, head to toe, in reverse. The idea was mooted and turned down. It's, and perhaps there's not too much here because a lot of the work was classified. Remember, everybody had to sign the Official Secrets Act and couldn't talk about it. And many of you have got relatives, you know, who served in the war. I mean, my mother was in the army during the war, and she never ever talked about it. The only time she ever mentioned something was I was watching a program in 1969, All Our Yesterdays, about 25 years after the war, and General Patton and his 10th Army came on. That was the army that was part of the deception program. You know, all those rubber tanks and rubber aeroplanes. And she said, I remember that. She said, I sent out some of the false signals about it. But, you know, they were classified, much of the stuff. So let's keep going. 1939, just the 12th of December, 6 days after the Anderson Committee met for the second time, 9 days after the war was declared by Mr. Chamberlain, and a letter was received addressed to the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. I'm going to read some extracts on it. Before I do, you've all heard of the term NIMBYism, not in my backyard. This is the most intense example of NIMBYism I've ever seen. It was a 4-page rambling letter, 4 foolscap pages. I'm just taking out a few quotes from it. It came from a Mr. George Hughes, who was a Bath solicitor. It's dated the 12th of September. And he claims in the letter he represents many residents of Bath. I quote as follows: the authorities in London appear to be labouring under the impression that Bath is a city with large houses occupied by wealthy people with retinues of obliging servants. Nothing could be further from the truth. He goes on to say, page 2, we are now burdened with an already excessive population. Many householders have already been compelled to admit into their houses, wait for it, verminous, disreputable, and ungrateful urban dwellers of foreign birth, some of whom are openly hostile to the British cause. I can tell you now, he didn't state it, but he was referring to the Irish workforce that had come over from Dublin, elsewhere in Ireland, and Liverpool to build the underground facilities at Corsham, Farley, Hungerford, Limpley Stoke, and all those places, yeah, as well. Yeah, we are now to be forced to billet large numbers of well-paid civil servants under conditions where our wives and daughters are to be turned into domestic drudges at the whim of the government. 95% of householders are quite unable to cater and give personal service to such affluent groups. A lot of prejudice, I thought, in that letter, but it was kept. I don't know whether it ever reached Winston Churchill. I doubt it. He was far too busy, but it reached many layers of the civil service in London, and they were appalled. They were appalled that this man of Bath, on your behalf, had sent this letter on your antecedent's behalf. Straight away, the Admiralty got back in Bath to the mayor, James Carpenter, and he tried to set the record straight. He put articles into the Bath press. He even offered one of his own houses. He had 2 houses, so he could do it, to the billetees. Moving on a bit, by the end of 1940, the population of Bath had gone up 20%. It was about 68,000 in September 39. And I mentioned the word press ganging of hotels, etc. It began to be accepted. There was a great strain on accommodation because it wasn't just the Admiralty staff. Many evacuated children came to Bath. Many evacuated people came to Bath. There's a comment about the Irish Labour. They were living here. For those young children, homes had to be found for them. 3 new sites were developed, the Hutment sites. They were very functional, but zero architectural value in a city with such, gorgeous Georgian splendor. By the end of 42, the population was now approaching 100,000, probably 12,000 of it being Admiralty people. But of course, it was being recognized that the Admiralty was a good source of employment, and you saw some of the professions earlier on. They did all sorts of things. They put on concerts, films, to which both the Admiralty staff and the Bath population could come to. Dances. Bath began to get more prosperous. This esprit de corps began to exist, and across the city, a bond of affection, I call it later down. And there's a reference at the bottom in Hansard, where the Vice Controller, Vice Admiral Sir John Hughes Hallett, talks about some of these things in 1961 to the House of Commons. Great sense of humor here. That cartoon was drawn up by a very senior member of the Naval Constructors Department. He was getting fed up of all the comments about all the Admiralty ever did was to drink cups of tea. So he drew this. Unfortunately, his son, who gave it to me, can't be here tonight, but I thought it was a marvelous sense of humor of the construction staff there. It was done for Christmas 1951. 1 or 2 more things. Bath Electronics Society, the Admiralty specialists form that. That's their call sign. They organised trips, which some of their neighbours came on. And there's a typical trip. This is about 1946 or 47, going for a day out. Don't worry about this letter, just a heading. It involves St. Martin's Hospital, who contacted them. They formed a relationship, and in late 47, the electronics department rewired St. Martin's Hospital in Bath for 0 charge, something to do. Because of that bond of affection between the Admiralty and the host city. Okay, I'll be very quick now. 1958 was an important date for the ship department. There was a complete overhaul of it. It was all getting too complicating, too difficult to run. 16 departments under one vice controller, and things were moving very fast in the design and nature of weapons and ships. So they reformed from 16 departments into 4 with a Director General in charge. I'll quickly throw those up and just give you less than a minute to look. Ship department, aircraft, weapons, and dockyard. A department there. BD is boom defense. So a lot of the DNC, Naval Construction Engineering Chief, Electrical Engineering, Marine Engineering, I referred to some of these before, all now under 4 departments. And so it became necessary at Foxhill to reorganize Foxhill. And this was done, D-Day for them was October the 1st, 1958. Now on the left is a diagrammatic. It doesn't matter that you can't at the back read some of the words, but there's about 7 blocks there, there were 7 blocks there, and housing different engineering functions. Overnight, and it must have been from 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, the buildings all changed with the people in them. Can you imagine all the filing cabinets, wheelbarrows full of records, all moving well between them? Not only the Navy, but the Admiralty did not like change. And it must have been quite traumatic. And at the end of the day, I imagine all the senior managers retired to Block H. This is blocks A to G. Might anyone know where Block H was? Thank you. It was the Foresters pub. And they did a roaring trade last night. Not last night was the pubs. Had England won. But no, the old Foresters pub. It's got a different name now, but they retired there, or so the story has it. I'm sure they did. Very quickly, the ship department, of course, had been working with the dockyards. I mentioned a third of the naval constructors went to the dockyards. And in 1939, Britain had a huge shipbuilding industry. And some of you will be familiar with some of these places. That's the 4 naval dockyards. But we had huge shipbuilders on the Clyde, the Tyneside, all the main rivers, smaller shipyards, and of course they liaised with the engine and turbine manufacturers, people like Perkins Diesel, Rolls-Royce engines. And from probably 1950 right through to 1970, the British shipbuilding industry got less and less and less. I tried to support it in 1970. I gave some money towards Jimmy Reed and the Upper Clyde shipbuilders because I was a young man with certain ideals then, and I thought he was doing a great job to save the lives and jobs of people up there. But it's more or less disappeared now, except for the dockyards in Scotland. We've recently built the aircraft carriers at Rosyth. So a third of the naval constructors were in those yards at any one time. And just very briefly, just 2 types of ships. They built lots of frigates, designed lots of frigates, designed lots of destroyers, anti-aircraft, anti-submarine, air direction. And these are the many destroyers, 2 types of destroyers basically, escorts and the important fleet destroyers. And these classes varied in terms of size, power, size of guns, armaments carried, radar, radio, etc. So those are some of the ships specifically designed here in Bath. And of course, don't forget all the other ships of the navies. We had a huge navy. In 1939, it was the most powerful and largest in the world, with 206,000 people in it, including reserves. And a book I would love to get, but it's just too expensive on the internet, is this one. I took all these from a library copy of it. NATO, Cold War, I mentioned before. Might recognize this. This was Britain's first nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed submarine, HMS Dreadnought, and that was designed here in Bath. And there are some of the people who designed it in the early 60s. Photograph taken at Fox Hill. Focused on Fox Hill, look at Ensley. These are all pictures from this century. Similar sort of buildings. Oh, that's an interesting picture. That's a wartime picture at Ensley, and it looks as if a Rear Admiral is saying goodbye after his stint of 2.5 years, and many of his staff are lined up there. You get a good idea of the fashion and the hairstyles there. Ensley, to get to it, as you know, it's a long way up the hill, up to Lansdale. So these are buses laid on to take people up to Ensley. Many people cycled to Warminster Road and Fox Hill, but Ensley had its buses, probably a few cyclists as well. Another well-known shot of Ensley, a blockade at Ensley there. Warminster Road, the huts look very similar, very utilitarian. There's another shot there, Warminster Road. And as you know, these are all housing developments now. Just very quick on this slide to say there was a big change in 62, but you can see Ensley has grown and Fox Hill is beginning to get smaller. Bit still going on at the Empire Hotel and the Pulteney Hotel. Then these are the ladies from Fox Hill, some of the Fox Hill ladies. You'll notice the Helen Shapiro type hairstyles, but everyone seemed very happy there. I'll just mention at Fox Hill, the Polaris, the American nuclear capability weapons. They were adopted by the British government when the Air Force, the V bombers, came to their end, and Bath, a lot of people involved in the transfer of it, and etc. I mentioned there, look, 430 people at Bath involved in it. These are the 4 submarines, the Resolution class, built at Vickers and the Camel Laird's in Liverpool. thanks to Simon Hanlon, this is the UK test firings of various Polaris in the 60s, early 70s. And if you want to go and see one, there's one at Duxford, the Imperial War Museum. Actually, that one used to be in London, but they moved it to Duxford. Ministry of Defence was formed in 1964 to bring all three armed services together so they could work together. And that's the important sentence to read. It was drafted by Dennis Healy, the Minister of Defence, and the heads of the three, of the Navy, Army, and Air Force. And everything was put together. It moved, a lot of it moved down to here, into Bath. I would imagine that many retired naval admirals probably spluttered into their pink gins at the thought of Army and Air Force types coming down into a naval establishment. But it had to happen. It was progress. And although I would imagine that naval administration carried on for a long time, things changed very slowly in the Royal Navy. The Admiralty stayed here at Bath until 2013. The last elements transferred to Abbey Wood, built in Bristol, at a cost of £254 million in 1996, when it opened by the Queen. I know some people here have worked there. So Ensley, Foxhill and Warminster Road was shut. And over the years, more staff moved here. Been here in Bathnet since 1939. And as you know, they became housing developments. Can you imagine the difference between working in a hutment in Ensley and 3 months later working in buildings like this? The physical change must have been great. Don't get me wrong about the hutments. Tremendous work was done inside them. But I think the environment in which you work is very, very important. Legacy. My ideas here. Does Bath even care about the fact the Admiralty isn't here? Remember, I couldn't find much in Bath. The MOD did an exhibition, some of you might attend it, in '89, after 50 years here, and all they produced was a small booklet. It's in the Guildhall Records Office. Very, very little, really. But they did contribute much to the prosperity of Bath. They came out of the Empire in 1995. Going into that apartment block now, you wouldn't even know the Admiralty were there. There's no memorial, there's no plaque. Well, at least I couldn't find one. There's 3 Hutment sites, now more or less all gone. And I feel that having spent 250 odd million in the 90s, it was built in 3 years at Bristol, one MOD hut could have been kept, staffed, maintained as a permanent memorial in Bath. But it didn't happen, and I don't know if anyone pushed for it. Could Bath do more? Yes, I think so. I'd like to see something at the art gallery or one of the museums. Maybe you've got ideas yourself. Unless that is done, the presence of Bath here will just become such a distant memory, it will disappear. Thank you. That's the end. But there's a reference in credits in there, so somebody research this.
Oh, thank you very much, David. I think we can all agree that when David researches something, he really researches it. I think finding that NIMBY letter was quite something. So fascinating. Okay, so we can take questions from anybody in the room. Put your hand up if you have a question at the front here. Can I ask, if anyone asking a question, for our people online, if you could hold the microphone quite close to your lips, please. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Was there anybody in total charge of the Admiralty when it was in Bath?
I mentioned Sir Humphrey Appleby. If you look at all the records, there's an easy answer to that and a little complicated approach to it. I mentioned I'd taken the slide of the Admiralty out because of the detail, and I put it actually into this discussion period. I'm going to go to it. It'll help answer it. There it is. Just very briefly, I know it's hard to see at the back, but you've got the Admiralty here in total from the Sea Lords, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and then various other important departments, including the Civil Lord, who was a graduate of the same university as I was, and some people listening online from the University of Liverpool. You've got all these departments here. And those Admiralty departments, those 40 directorates and departments reported into a number of these, to the 2nd Sea Lords Department, the 3rd, the 4th, and some of these down here. It was very, very convoluted, and barriers were formed. And so you had all these controllers and vice controllers and system, but they were of departments and all that, or groups of departments. I would say there was nobody fully in charge. There is now at Bristol a guy called Andrew Start. He's a civilian and he's over some of the admirals down there. And there was a reference in my references. There's a reference here to 1961, some Hansard, where he'd become an MP. Vice Admiral Sir John Hughes Hallett refers and tells an astonished Parliament, House of Commons, that there was no one in charge during his time as a vice controller. But it worked. It's the civil service. It works without someone being in charge. It did. As long as you had your Sir Humphreys who liaised with the government. And that was partially the job of George Cotton in the early days. He was put in there, he liaised with Sir Winston Churchill, he liaised, most important, with other government departments, such as the Treasury, to get funding. So the easy answer is no one was in charge, but it's quite complex to explain why. I don't think it would happen these days. I've looked at the structure at Abbey Wood, and it's very well structured. But interesting question, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Which one?
Well, I have both a point of interest and a question. As a point of interest, you said there is almost no memorial to the Admiralty in Bath. The only one I can say exists, because I now live on the Ensley estate, and on the very edge of the Ensley estate, there's a little concrete post about 2 foot high, which says MPBW on it, Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. And I think that is perhaps the only memorial to the Admiralty in Bath. My question, though, is, well, all right, yeah. Well, when I first moved to Bath 40 years ago, I was told that the hutments had been built before the Second World War in anticipation of them being used as hospitals, but then they were subsequently not needed. Is that correct, or is that a myth?
I don't think it's correct. I've come across that, but I've seen the plans at the National Archives dated, 1940, 1941. So I think it's probably a myth. They may well have been facilities earmarked there for hospitals, but pardon the pun, I've seen nothing concrete on that. And of course, it didn't happen. There's another question in the back.
Just really trying to understand, given the industry and given the Admiralty were here in Bath, why didn't the Germans try and bomb more often? Was it just not relatively important enough?
I think your last comment there is spot on. They didn't really know what it was, and it wasn't considered important enough. I think had they known, there's no doubt, in addition to the Baedeker raids, they would have gone for them. Perhaps their intelligence was poor, perhaps there was poor coordination from Admiral Canaris's department in German naval intelligence naval military intelligence, passed on to the Army Air Force. They had so many fish to fry with a huge front in the east against the Soviet Union. It just didn't happen. If there's no more questions, I would like to just amplify on one slide. I don't know if you noticed on the my Mulberry Harbors slide, I said there's something I'd like to mention in the discussion, question and answers, that has a great Bath relevance. And I'm going to, if I can, Joe, it'll take about 4 minutes, cover that now. Can I do that?
Has anyone got a burning question they want to ask before we do that? Otherwise, I think
These
Well-
big slides have a real Bath relevance.
We do have a question
Okay.
from someone online, David. In the section on R&D, I saw a reference to patents. Were military developments patented?
I can't honestly answer that. The fact there was a sub-department there with reference to patents would infer that. But of course, it was also important that developments did not infringe other people's existing patents. So the work could have been of that nature.
Okay, David, do you want to run through your slides very
Yes,
quickly and then we'll
yes,
wrap it up?
Yes, this has Mulberry
Because
Harbors.
we do have to empty the
Yes,
building
yeah.
before 9, so thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll get out in time, Joe. Let's look at Mulberry Harbour. I mentioned that severe storm. I mentioned the severe storm, and it was a very bad storm. I'm talking about Mulberry Harbour B here, and I looked at the ship's log of a ship, one of our biggest cruisers that had done a great job on D-Day, HMS Diadem. I did this work back in 2009. The storm was very bad, high waves, and Diadem was in danger. In fact, it was hit by what's called a rhino ferry, which is a great long line of pontoon ships and also a landing craft vessel. It was hit and holed in 5 places on the waterline. Water was pouring in. They're the 2 ships that hit it, MT-92, a coaster, the Rhino ferry. Coming down a bit, 5 large holes, I just mentioned. I spoke to members of the Diadem Association. They've all passed away now. They've crossed the bar back in 2009. And 3 or 4 of them could remember this. One of them, Captain Wright, he was a lieutenant then. He told me he was in charge inside trying to shore up the holes inside. And they tried to do that, but the ship was taking on water. The ship was rocking. They were worried it would be hit even further. I spoke to 2 of the Marines who told me the storm was so bad, they were locked into their gun areas. No one was allowed on deck except for 4 people. We'll see why. The conditions were bad. Everyone was locked on board the ship, but an engineer was lowered overboard. Urgent action had to be taken, otherwise the Navy would have lost one of its cruisers. And in the early afternoon, engineering room artificer, 4th class, Albert George Hutment, was lowered. He was the only engineering ERA artificer who had skills in welding. Most of them on board were fitters and turners. He was lowered down with 2 people in a sort of like a big Moses basket, and metal plates were lowered down to him by these 4 guys on deck. He was down there outside for 3 hours trying to repair this. High wind, water coming up, danger of being buffeted, a worry that the Luftwaffe might attack from a very high height. Thankfully, they didn't. They did see a V1 go over. They didn't know what it was. It's in the log as a pilotless rocket ship plane. Anyway, he fixed it. He made it safe and secure. And his commanding officer, Captain Clifford, recommended him for an award. And he got mentioned in dispatches. I thought that was a pretty lousy award for the work he did and the danger he took. Captain Wright said to me, We didn't give that poor, and he didn't use the word blighter. I'll leave it to you to imagine. We didn't give anything for the chance of that poor blighter outside. Hocking survived, he did the job, and I'm delighted to tell you that 3 subsequent generations of the Hocking family are in the first 2 rows of this audience. Hocking came to live in Bath in 1954. I wanted to finish with that very personal touch of Bath to wrap it up and show you that something must be done in Bath in memory of the Admiralty. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
David, thank you. Thank you for that call to action as well at the end. And can I thank everyone for coming out tonight? I hope you've enjoyed the talk. And let's have one last round of appreciation for David.